Hey guys, I'm Shindig, and with the release of Phase 3 and Tribe of the Crusader coming out tomorrow, many raid guilds will be stepping into and progressing a new raid for the first time since Ulduar. As such, I thought it would be an interesting conversation to talk about progression raiding in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. Now, I believe that there's something in here for everyone, for both the most competitive players that have spent many hours on the PTR, and for those that are more casual and will be stepping into TOC or TOGC for the first time. I'll draw on examples from Wrath Classic, but I think many of the principles I'll cover are applicable to all iterations of the game, be it retail, Wrath Classic, or even Vanilla Classic. So, who am I? For a little bit of background, I've been raid leading for about 2 years in Classic World of Warcraft. I played with both casual and hardcore raid teams. Currently, I'm the raid lead of the guild Lookalive's primary raid team. We're a moderately competitive group based on the Benediction server in Wrath Classic. I also play retail, spending most of my time doing mythic keystones and mythic progression of the current raid tier in Dragonflight. Now, before we begin, we need to address the elephant in the room, which is preparation. I will not be covering it in this video. I believe preparation plays an important role in helping smooth out progression, but not a lot of the player base enjoys engaging with the preparation side of raiding. So I'm going to keep the focus of the conversation on what can be done during raid, and hopefully there's something in here for everybody, regardless of how much preparation you've done. So how do you do progression well? Early on in boss progression, the most important thing is you want to stop being someone that will wipe the raid if they're targeted by a mechanic. Here for reference is a pull breakdown of our guild's Algalon progression. Now, very early on, it's okay to experiment with mechanics and map out your cooldown timings. Can I use Cloak of Shadows to live this ability? Or maybe I can ice block it. But otherwise, the progression mindset should be, I don't want to be the person that causes a pull to go from being alive to not being alive. To that end, it's helpful to think, what if I was the person targeted by this mechanic? And develop a plan. Being able to actively learn from other people's mechanics is a valuable skill. If everyone needs to experience a mechanic to learn from it, that's a lot of extra pulls and a lot of extra progression. And that plan can sometimes include calling for an external. In lower end raiding guilds, externals often go unused. Things like Guardian Spirit, Pain Suppression, and Hand of Sacrifice to name a few. Even if the external doesn't arrive, if you call for one or say anything of the sort in voice comms, the other 24 people in your raid that weren't thinking about how to keep you alive will now be thinking about it. That extra attention might be enough to keep you alive. Offloading it as being something that only you're thinking about to being a problem that the raid is going to solve will more often than not increase your likelihood of surviving, especially if you have 24 other raiders you can trust. As you put more pulls in, you begin to develop habits. These are things you do every pull. For example, knocking the lashers back during the Freya encounter. I'll pull up our main tank's POV here. Do it consistently enough, and over time, the rest of the raid begins to adapt and also do the same thing. To be a good player or play in a good guild, you ideally want to make this an optimal thing. So for instance, whether or not your raid chooses to run as the lashers are dying may depend on if you have sufficient knockbacks. So as a warlock using Seed of Corruption, the ideal thing would be to remain planted to maintain uptime and stay in your AoE damage window. If you're in a raid guild where you can trust your other 24 raid members, that decision becomes you choosing to stay planted, with the understanding that your teammates with knockbacks will execute their roles correctly. This way you can maintain your damage and solve the mechanic. Do these knockbacks consistently and effectively, and the rest of the raid will begin to predict and adjust to that. At a more competitive level, you ideally want to play with people and give them the trust that they will solve the mechanic when it's correct for you to be in your cooldowns or your damage window. In lower end guilds, you might not have 24 players you can trust to have your back on a mechanic. So your best bet for solving Freya Lashers might not be the scenario where you're pumping out the most damage. Maybe you recognize you need to run because the knockback goes out early and the Lashers won't die quickly enough before they return to the raid. Or perhaps the knockback doesn't happen at all. In this case, you sacrifice your damage to solve the mechanic. In Wrath Classic, the damage sacrifice is often forgiving. But for more difficult fights with DPS checks like XE Hard Mode, Algalon, or Yogg 0, in order to kill these bosses, your damage will need to come from somewhere else. Often this damage comes from higher item level or boss nerfs. Better gear often provides the necessary leeway to help solve mechanics. Thus, the answer for a more casual guild may be sacrificing your DPS to do the mechanic, and lean on the extra item level your raid will have by the time you kill the boss. Another good example is freeing the frozen NPCs on Hodir. As a spellcaster with the Shaman crit buff, you ideally want to slam all your damage into Hodir, with the trust your teammates will free the ads once frozen. If you're needed to help free ads during this time, you're sacrificing your damage to do the mechanic, meaning your raid will either need to learn to better deal with the mechanic or lean on the higher item level your group will have by the time you kill the boss. So in a high-end setting, you should ask yourself, should I be somebody handling this mechanic? And if the answer is yes, then aggressively and predictably solve that mechanic. If the answer is no, then you want to give the other players who are the right people to be solving that mechanic the opportunity to do so. In a more casual setting, if the answer is no, you may need to sacrifice your individual play for the success of the group. And this leads to raid assignments. Now, this topic begins to creep into a realm of preparation, but having raid assignments can also be a thing that actively changes and evolves over the course of several polls. As such, I think it's worth talking about. Having assignments for raid defenses, externals, and mechanics allows you to communicate important rules during a poll without it being something that everyone needs to think about. By delegating responsibility, you offload the problem from being something that you need to solve to being a problem that you trust your teammates to solve, which more often than not increases the chance that your raid does the mechanic correctly. This is particularly applicable for raid leads, or people whose job it is to communicate multiple happenings during an encounter. I see it quite often in lower end guilds, where there are no assignments and the raid lead is responsible for calling every mechanic. What ends up happening is that either a mechanic is missed because the raid lead is overburdened and the pull becomes a wipe without any meaningful learning being done, or callouts made from pull to pull aren't consistent, meaning the entire raid needs to put their brains into overdrive and learn every mechanic on the basis that they can't rely on the raid lead to consistently communicate certain mechanics. Again, if you can offload the responsibility from being something you need to call out to being something somebody else either needs to call out or do, you lessen the chance of missing an important assignment. And this is why, as a raid lead, you need to be very cautious of mechanics called 50% of the time. If you call a mechanic 100% of the time, people will do it. If you call it 0% of the time, people will learn to do it. 10%, 20%, even up to 50% of the time, it's infrequent enough that people will learn to do it. But if you call a mechanic 90% of the time, the 10% of the time you don't call it is not going to go over so well. So you need to be careful you haven't lulled your raid into a false sense of security, and that you don't wipe the raid off of something unsaid because people are expecting something to either be said or done. Now, let's talk about positioning. Many range players plant and only move as a reaction to a mechanic, but many classes also have instant cast abilities that let them move. At all points during a boss fight, you should have somewhere that is the best place for you to be, and a degree of how urgent it is for you to get there. Where in the room do I need to be? Then move there on your movement globals. If you can anticipate your movement, you can better plan around your globals, such that you minimize the loss in uptime that incurs when you need to move. As a tank, always be mindful of where the boss should be and think, can I do this exact same movement every pull so that everyone else can plan around this? From pull to pull, by being in the same place every time, you can anticipate what might happen to you at any given spot. Predictably interacting with the boss in the same way frees up brain space to think about other things. For example, suppose you always kick the first Searing Flames cast on General Vezax. I'm doing this thing, and by doing it every time, it makes it so that your other raiders will not kick the first Searing Flames cast, on the trust and assumption that you will do it. That said, if you ever miss that interrupt, maybe you're out of range or you hit it at the wrong time, in this instance, you need to communicate that. Otherwise, nobody's going to cover for you because you've conditioned the whole raid to expect that you'll cover that specific interrupt. This is the downside of predictability. Despite this downside, it's absolutely worth it. You get so much free brain power off of being predictable that it's worth letting yourself be lulled into that false sense of security with the trust that other people will call out if you need to wake up and fix that. So, when it comes to making raid changes during progression, these are discussions worth having, but you need to actually have those discussions or else call out in the middle of a poll if there will be a deviation from the expected raid plan. And that is how you can do progression raiding better in World of Warcraft. Otherwise, that's it. I hope you found this video helpful. I would appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. It really helps me out. Thanks for watching.